Hey, did you guys know that Trapper just got new lore? You might not have realised this because for the past year or so, Dead by Daylight's lore has been quietly left to die. Between the prioritisation of licensed content over originals, and the Tome lore system being retired with the replacement of the old Tome challenges with the new quests. In terms of original stories we've gotten in 2025, DBD has never had a more meagre and lacking year. We've had 3 original characters, Aurella, Krasu and V, and 3 Tome stories for the Blight, Jane and the House of Arkham from January to May, as the last instalment in the old style of the archives. That's 6 stories in an entire year, up until we got to Trapper at least. As a point of comparison, Tome 2 Reckoning had 5 stories in one single mid-chapter patch back in 2020. Jane, Doctor, Spirit, David and the Observer. And that year 2020 had 19 Tome stories in it, on top of 6 stories for the new original characters that released that year as well, meaning we've gone from 25 original stories in 2020, the year I started my channel, to just 6 in 2025. We are getting less than a quarter of the new lore that we used to get, and people ask me why I don't make main lore videos anymore. But maybe our era of starvation is coming to an end, because Tome 23, Cradle and Grave, opened as the Sinister Grace chapter dropped, and Trapper, DBD's poster boy everyone loves to 3-out, just got his second Tome story, 6 years after his last appearance in Tome 1 Awakening. And let me not bury the lead here when I say, this story is really fucking good. It's easily Trapper's best appearance to date, and while it is not perfect, it includes a bunch of details and character moments both in the story itself and in the tie-in comic panels that Trapper fans, and many lore fans in general, have been waiting for a really long time. But what is the story actually about? And what does its existence bode for the future of DBD's storytelling via the Tome system? Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to Tome 23, and the bittersweet future of Dead by Daylight's lore. This video is going to kind of be in 2 parts. The first part talking about the Trapper himself and the story that he just got, and the second part covering what the story means, how it's written, and how it's presented, and what that means for the future of DBD's lore in the Tomes. Let's start with the good stuff. Evan's new lore is great. It's a wonderful bridge between the Evan that we always knew from day 1 of Dead by Daylight, from his presentation in the Tome, and how he comes across in the game. But it's been so long since we covered the Trapper's lore, and so much longer since his last installment came out all the way back in Tome 1, that we might need a refresher. So here's the Cliff's Notes for the backstory of Evan McMillan. Evan grew up under the thumb of his father Archie, a domineering industrialist who owned a huge mining and refining operation in the Seattle area. Archie was, to put no finer point on it, a complete maniac. He violently mistreated his son and encouraged him to do the same to the mine workers, maggots as he called them, which put Evan in a difficult position. He didn't really have his heart in the violence in the same way that his father did, preferring to draw and paint. But his father constantly pushed him to acts of cruelty as he tried to groom his son into his enforcer. This culminated in the collapse of the McMillan family mine, where hundreds of mine workers were trapped underground in an engineered explosion. Evan made short work of his father immediately after, breaking his legs and sealing him in the basement where he would starve to death. The rest, as they say, is history. The fog closed in, and the entity claimed Evan McMillan for its own. And thus Tome 23 begins. Yeah, there's a novelty in it. We've been getting DBD killer stories for almost 10 years now, but we've never seen what happens to those killers immediately after the entity takes them before. For years I've been wrapping up my stories with, and thus the entity claimed X person for its own, and that's usually just been the end of the killer story, but here, it's just the beginning. We're going to see some stuff that we've never seen before. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Well then, let's get started with Tome 23, Cradle and Grave, just as the entity claims Evan McMillan for its own. Young Evan staggers up the basement stairs, locking his father away. As he climbs the stairs, he dreams of a future away from him, and his mine, and his workers, and his cruelty. If not even a proper future, at least a break from it. and the entity is lying in wait to give him that break, except maybe not in the way he anticipated. The fog closes in and Evan turns back, runs down the basement stairs and into the dark. He keeps going and going and going until the fog clears and he finds himself in a rather different sort of basement. Cold, dark, boarded up with wooden planks, and his father nowhere to be found. In its centre is a structure that might be all too familiar. A shrine dotted with meat hooks. Hooks Evan feels a strange affinity for. Not enough affinity to stop him running like hell as soon as he realises he's not in Seattle anymore. He scrambles up the basement stairs and finds nothing. No mine, no McMillan estate, not even the grounds of the trials. Just a barren, rocky expanse of nothingness. He walks and walks and walks. Not even sure how long it's been since he started out. It feels like days or maybe even longer as the memories of his father's fate fade. But that basement of hooks and decay is vivid, as if he only saw it yesterday. Then suddenly, snap, a bear trap stuck around his leg. Evan screams, scrabbling at the metal jaws trying to prise it off his leg, but the fog coils around him before he can, and he awakens back at that basement, right in front of the hooks. Back where he started. The basement, or whatever's in it, is playing games with him, and Evan didn't escape from his father to be fucked around like this. He tries to leave again, but is this time ensnared with heavy meat hooks on chains that bite into his flesh. He rips the hooks from the chains, tries to keep going, but the blood loss is too much. And when he passes out, guess where he winds up again? The basement is all Evan knows now. There's no point in leaving. He's tried and tried, so now he just rots there, time passing at rates he could no longer track, as he realises that this is his life now. He turns to the Shrine of Hooks, the one that's been calling to him all this time just because he has no alternative anymore. And he sees a vision of his father, a vision of his violence as he kills his brother with a meat cleaver. A meat cleaver that Evan can feel as if it was in his hand right now. He communes with whatever it is down there, reaching out to him through the hooks, and he reaches back. "What do you want?" he asks. "What's next for me?" And with a hungry growl, the man who was once Evan McMillan is gone, and only the trapper remains. Okay, let's break this down, because damn, this story breaks some new ground. First of all, there's a thing I was talking about earlier, how the core conceit of the story is just unlike anything we've seen before from the tomes. The overwhelming majority of our killer tomes are set during the events of the base lore. Before the entity takes them, it's sort of a zoom in on one particular point in their life. Trapper's first tome was like this. It was a story of his youth to try and sow the seeds of the life Evan would eventually come to lead in the fog, but it definitely had its problems. As the first tome, you could kind of tell that they were new to this because they wanted to make Evan's character more sympathetic and played up his father's brutality and mistreatment of the workers to set a contrast with Evan's more nuanced approach. That was the job of Tome 1, to establish the man who turned Evan into a killer and show us that Archie McMillan was the worst piece of shit to ever live. It's implied that Archie killed Evan's mother and his uncle, really anybody who could provide a nurturing influence in his son's life. It's outright stated that he was physically and emotionally abusive to his son, and we get to see the vicious thuggery with which he treats his employees too. But it seemed incompatible in a lot of ways with the base lore, which states outright that Evan idolised his father, was more than willing to kill and abuse the workers for him, and implies he might have been even worse than his old dad. This doesn't really line up with Tome 1's portrayal though. Evan's portrayed as hating and fearing his father, having every good reason to do so, and despite the stories saying that Evan both hates and loves his father, we're never exactly shown why Evan would love his father, especially not to the point of idolising him as base lore claims. I like Evan's portrayal in his base lore as this merciless, cruel enforcer of his father's will, and I also like him in the tome where he's struggling to express himself while his father's trying to mould him into his successor. But I've always struggled to see the two as compatible with each other. And I said in my initial video on the Trapper that he needed a second tome to weld that gap shut between the sensitive, fearful Evan that we're meant to root for and the brutal enforcer of the McMillan estate that the base lore sets up. Tome 23 is that weld. I think it does that pretty decently, but not perfectly. The story opens with the end of Evan's base lore. him locking his father in the basement where he will eventually starve to death. In the original lore, this was implied to be an act of cruelty. The basement was locked, Archie was starved and abandoned. The language used suggests that Evan did this deliberately, and this is after it's described that Archie's mental health was degrading and Evan took a more hands-on approach to managing the estate directly. These few things play up how Archie's power over the estate and power over his son was slipping gradually over the years, an act which culminated in Evan's final betrayal of his father before the entity took him. But Tome 23 completely changes that context and sets Evan up to be this more sympathetic figure, similar to his first tome. First of all, as Evan is climbing the stairs up away from the locked basement, he thinks about how he'll call the fire department and let his father out, and turn him over to the authorities. He never intended for his father to die as a result of his actions. The only reason Archie died in that basement is because the entity took Evan before he could call the authorities to collect him. Evan even says later that he expects to get an earful from his dad when he finds him again, implying that even after everything he's been through, he still has a vision of the future where his father is part of his life, even if he's a hostile one. This version of Evan McMillan is anything but cruel. He won't even kill his father, instead content to turn him over to the authorities and run for his life. The comic panels support this reading too, of Evan being more mellow and merciful. During the panel that depicts Archie being locked in the basement, Evan is not shown breaking his father's legs like the base lore described. He didn't want to hurt or kill Archie, just contain him, until he could be arrested. Maybe he got hurt when Evan pushed him to the ground, or he injured himself trying to get out. But Evan is not shown at all to be responsible for or even aware of this happening. But the biggest revelation about Evan's nature in the comic panels is seeing the moment the minds blew. The base lore said before that nobody had ever proved that Evan led over 100 men to those dark tunnels before detonating the explosives and sealing them to their fate, which implies obviously that he did do it, but just that there wasn't enough evidence to people to prove it after the fact. But according to the comic panels, there wasn't any proof that he did it because he actually didn't do it. Archie's the one pressing the button and giving the orders. At worst, Evan's an accomplice, scared into obedience by his father, and at best he's only barely involved at all. And since what exactly happened was a little ambiguous in the base lore, this technically isn't even a retcon. This is just new context that puts Evan's moral compass firmly on the forgivable side. Tome 23 does a great job of defining Evan's character and his relationship with his father, even though it's not the focus of the story. It feels laser targeted at the criticisms and issues of his first tome and provides the best exhibition of that relationship to date. I only really have one problem with Archie's role in this new story, and it is not in the written lore. It's in the comic panels, because Archie McMillan does not look like that. I get that it's a new stylization, and not all the characters are meant to be literal portrayals of how they looked, but it took me a second to realise that this was Archie McMillan at all, because Archie has an established look already. Hell, he's one of the very few DBD non-playable characters to have an established look and design that we've seen several times before. He's in Trapper's first home cinematic, there's a portrait of him in the casting of Frank Stone, and he's even in Hooked on You as well. He's slightly different in all these adaptations, but a few traits remain consistent. Archie's skinny and lean and usually has some sort of facial hair or maybe sideburns, as a contrast with his son who's huge, muscular, clean-shaven and eventually, as a killer, bald. But in Tome 23's comic, Archie is much more built out. He's got broad arms and shoulders, he's clean-shaven, he's blockier, and in general just looks like an older version of Evan. I've always appreciated the difference between Archie and Evan's physicalities, because it shows that Archie and Evan are more different than they both like to believe. Archie is an industrialist and a petty tyrant of the McMillan estate who's never done any physical work in his life. He's not where he is because he worked hard for it. He got it through power, money, and the cruelty with which he wielded both. So him being old and skinny and lean and mean makes sense because he's done very little actual work himself to put on that muscle. Evan is the opposite. He spent time in the mines with the workers. He's done his fair share of physical labour for his father, and so him being stronger and bigger makes sense. The difference between the two of them physically mirrors their different approaches to work and power. Evan is not an inherently violent man inclined to cruelty. It's not in his nature in the same way that it's in his father's nature, even though he'd be far better at it than Archie himself if he ever really put his mind to it, if he chose to use his physical strength to abuse or overpower other people. Tome 23 redesigns Archie completely. Now he's big and strong just like Evan, and whilst it does increase the family resemblance and make Archie more immediately intimidating at first glance, it still doesn't quite feel right. Archie's old design was consistent throughout his old appearances, because it works, because it shows that his hold over Evan is psychological rather than physical. And his new look is so hard to recognise it took me a while to even realise it was Archie at all. But this is my only issue with the Archie and Evan relationship in Tome 23, and it is limited to the comic panel anyway, so it's not a huge deal. While the comic panel is focused on the story of Archie and Evan, the main story itself is about what happened after that. After Evan was taken by the Entity, and it shows us what we were told years ago, when DBD's world was first being established. It's pretty common knowledge that Evan was tortured into obedience to serve the Entity as a killer using the hooks that are embedded in his shoulder, but the details of exactly what happened and how have always been a little, foggy, shall we say. Evan's torment is fully depicted here, and it is far less graphic than I expected. He's taken to that basement, the place in the trials closest to the Entity, and he's confronted not with horrifying monsters or eternal agony, but simply the truth that now he's here in the realm, there is no going back to a normal life. He tries to escape time and time again, and yet every time he leaves he finds there's just nothing there. He comes to the surface and finds nothing. Just a rocky, lifeless expanse, with nowhere to go except right back to that basement. More than the bear traps and the hooks, that is the torture that Evan endures in Tome 23. The understanding sinking in that there's nothing here for him except the Entity. That in the face of its overwhelming power and hunger, his little human life is entirely in its hands. God knows how much time has passed while this realization sinks into him. Time flows strangely in the Entity's realm, so he could have spent decades resisting its influence, or have given in just a couple of days. The end result doesn't matter because he will break eventually. The Entity has all the time in the world to wait, and when he gives in it's not because he's forced to, but because he simply can't do anything else. And thus the Entity claims Evan McMillan for its own. It took almost a decade, but the Trapper's story finally feels complete with Tome 23. We have a clean arc from the beginning of Evan's life under the thumb of his father all the way up to the moment that he discarded his humanity completely and became a killer for the Entity as the Trapper. Every killer deserves their story to feel as complete as his. It's simple, it shows its age in places, but Trapper is a more complete character than he ever has been before because of this tome. A fitting tribute to DBD's first and only real poster boy. And that kinda hurts, because a lot of people won't even know where to find it. The tome pages are squirreled away down here, next to the settings menu and the game credits, where unless you already know to look for them, you're just not going to find these stories. This story has a lot of cool things that many people would actually like if they read it. A lot of Trapper fans thought he deserved a second tome to flesh him out. I used to see demands all the time for more stories set inside the fog itself, and there's been so much art and fiction written trying to illustrate how the Entity communicates with the killers, and this story does all of that and more. But the way the tomes are organised means a lot of people will just never find this story. Back when the tome system was directly attached to the Rift Pass, it was easy to draw people directly to the lore. Still doesn't happen very much because the lore unlocks were spaced out over months and were still relatively hard to navigate to, but now it's almost impossible to find the story content in the tomes unless you already know where it is and are actively looking for it. I made a video almost 3 years ago talking about how inaccessible and awkward DBD's lore was back then. This is when the Rift and the lore were integrated directly together in the Battle Pass. Many of the issues I highlighted in that video are still present today, although the stories I think have generally improved since back then, and the new tome system has an easier UI to manage. But there are still so many barriers that prevent players from fully enjoying this game's lore, and the tomes being tucked away from everything else in the game does not help. Why can't we access character tome stories from these characters' bio pages? Why can't we listen to the audio logs from the base bio or the tomes while navigating menus, spending blood points, or queuing for a match? What happened to the tome cinematics that used to be staples of new tomes for the average player? It has been almost 3 years since that video, and we're arguably in a worse state than we were before in terms of getting the average player to engage with the lore, even though the lore has gotten better since those days. If you ask me, I think Behaviour has largely given up on large-scale DBD storytelling because they don't know how to monetize it effectively. In the 3 years since that video, we've had a precipitous increase in the amount of licensed content that we get every year, and a corresponding drop in the number of original characters that we get, and the balance sheets don't lie. Licenses make a buttload of money, so the level of return on investment in expanding DBD's world just isn't there, at least not at the moment. Even if it makes DBD a more creatively complete game to add more originals and expand its world. The originals that we have had in that time, like Doomed Course, Sinister Grace, and Steady Pulse, have been some of the best DBD stories we've had in years, but they've been overshadowed by the huge glossy licenses like FNAF, and have been letdowns in other areas like gameplay balance or bugginess, all but ensuring they stay overshadowed. It doesn't help that the other attempts to make more of DBD's lore that did come in that time, like the Legion comic, Project T, and the casting of Frank Stone, weren't particularly successful either, or in Project T's case got cancelled completely before it could begin. The Legion comic was delayed by over a year between the 3rd and 4th issues, and the casting of Frank Stone had awful performance problems, unlikable main characters and a steep price tag, with the idea of Frank Stone coming to the fog being bandied around as maybe a killer, maybe a trapper legendary, who the fuck knows at this point. In many ways, Tome 23 is the perfect symbol of DBD's original world building and storytelling. Hello, Cassie. I see, very well. The story itself is good. The writers should be very proud of themselves. But nobody will read it because the company as a whole can't or doesn't want to turn their work into something that they can sell. It's why they were so okay shelving the tomes for 6 months so they could rush out the quest system. They weren't effectively monetizing the tome stories anyway, so what's the point in trying to integrate them into the new system? If I was the writer who wrote Tome 23, or Houndmaster, or Krasu, or Orella, I'd be very proud of myself, but I'd also be quite upset if this lore was displayed or presented in the way that Behaviour has been treating their original characters lately. I don't know. Houndmaster's lore is attached to a character that barely works, a character that has never really worked, and has never received a skin in the store in the year since she came out. Krasu's story was attached to a bland killer power whose only notable quality was being absurdly broken for about 2 weeks, before the fading back into obscurity with a couple of nerfs. And Trapper's Tome 23 story is the lore expansion he has always needed, stuffed away into the sidelines where nobody will ever read it. That is the future of DBD's lore. I suspect the stories will be good and I'm looking forward to covering them going forwards as new ones come out, but it will break my heart knowing that they will be continuously overshadowed. Could be worse. For a lot of this year, we've had no original storytelling whatsoever, and after the January chapter, we are getting the Solo Survivor in May, into the 10th anniversary original chapter as well, so it's not all licenses all the way down forever going forwards. We have been through the worst of it, I think, but as someone who's been around the block a lot, who's seen DBD's lore at its best and its worst, it very much feels like we're in a dark period for now. I don't know when Tome 24 will come. Maybe it will be when the mid-chapter drops later in November. Maybe it won't be until January when the new chapter hits. But we do know that more stories are coming. Haddie, Dredge, and Houndmaster have all been explicitly confirmed to have stories already in the pipeline. And I wouldn't be surprised if Knight and Elodie were incoming too. Maybe we're going to get Cassie lore someday, that would be nice. And as a reader and creator, I'm excited to sink my teeth into these stories. I just wish Behaviour loved them as much as I do.